Great to have you with us for our first podcast in the 2020-2021 season of the Digging Deep Bible Study. And we're studying the Ten Commandments. We're doing a year-long study of the Decalogue. And our first month study has to do with the significance of the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament. And then next month we will shift to thinking about how the Ten Commandments are considered in the New Testament. You'll notice there's someone sitting beside me here who's not Ben Gisselbaugh, our regular co-host, and that's because Ben is sick, but we're very thankful to have with us today Chris Lydon.
Hello.
One of our preachers here at Lakeside, and Chris has been on the podcast before, so you're familiar with him, and we're thankful to have him with us. Ben, unfortunately, has COVID-19, and he was hoping that his symptoms would not be anything that would keep him from doing the podcast today, but he's feeling pretty badly, and we certainly want to pray for him that there won't be any complications associated with this. Chris, you know, in the life of ministry, sometimes we are up close and personal with people and giving them a hug during a difficult time, and this happened with Ben, that he was doing a funeral this past week, and as it turns out, someone at the funeral had COVID. Maybe they didn't know it at the time, but they did, and so apparently Ben got it there, and hopefully this will pass very quickly and won't be any trouble, but we do want to pray for him.
It can be very difficult, especially in times like that, you know, to always remember to keep distance and, you know, practice safe practices during that time. But
we're very thankful at Lakeside to be meeting for all of our services, and we are trying to be cautious about those things. And thankfully, at this point, I don't think we have any cases at Lakeside of which I'm aware. And if you have some at your congregations, then please know that we're praying for all the Christians everywhere who might be suffering with that or even with other diseases. And we look forward to studying with you this year, and I trust that you've been digging in the book of Exodus, but also in other books of the Old Testament, especially Deuteronomy, as we have the repeat of the Ten Commandments in chapter 5, and we'll be noticing some things there. I hope that you've been memorizing the Ten Commandments. It'll be very helpful for you in this study if you can commit those to memory, and then you will have a context in which to place them. And I specifically asked that we would read chapters 12 through 20 in the book of Exodus to get a sense of the various commands that God gave to the people even before the Ten Commandments were given, because we may tend to think that God began to give Israel commands on Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, but actually God began to give them commands earlier than that when we think about the Hebrew nation in captivity in Egypt. And I just made a list myself as I read through the text. God gave them groups. I put it in groups of commands. Commands having to do with the Passover, then commands in chapter 13 having to do with the consecration of the firstborn child to God, then commandments having to do with the crossing of the Red Sea in chapter 14, commandments having to do with manna in chapter 16, the conditional promise that he gave for the people to not receive any of the diseases that came upon the other people, provided that they would keep his commandments. Then there were the commandments regarding the water in the rock at Massa, and then the commandment concerning Moses writing a book after the battle at Rephidim against the Amalekites. And you may have noticed some more, but when you think about God's provision for the Israelites in the book of Exodus, we don't need to overlook the fact that God gave them commandments which, in keeping, would be their preservation on their way from Egypt to the place where they would get the commandments.
yeah, a lot happened after the plagues and before Sinai, and we don't need to overlook that. Obviously, one of the big things that we focus on is the crossing of the sea, the Red Sea. But even that, after they come across, they didn't just step right over to Mount Sinai. There was a lot that happened in between the time they came across the sea and the time they came to Mount Sinai. And so that's an important part even of study and even looking at the Ten Commandments and Exodus chapter 20 is what is leading up to that as well.
Right, and the people had to show their faith in obedience, and that's going to be the way it is for Israel from here on out. It's just that the details of the covenant that they would need to keep had not yet been fully explained. as they will be here. Okay, David Walker, one of our good brethren at Lakeside, asked us on the Facebook group about the words statutes, ordinances, and judgments as words that denote laws or commandments that God gave to the Israelites. And if you look at the Hebrew words that are translated statutes, then you find words and these other words, you find that they have slightly different semantic fields. In other words, they can refer to slightly different things, but they are used synonymously in the text to refer to God's commandments. The word ordinances refers to a judicial decree, as does the word judgment. And often these are translated, these two English words translate the same Hebrew word. And you might compare, for example, Deuteronomy 4:1 and Exodus 24 and verse 3. They both translate the Hebrew word mishpat as judgment in one verse and in ordinance in another verse. And, of course, the word statute is basically the same idea as a commandment. So we have slightly different semantic fields here. One is more of a judicial term that has to do with God making a judgment about something, and then one has to do with God giving a law. But we don't need to separate these two ideas too much, because obviously a commandment is going to reflect God's judgment, and a judgment is going to be in keeping with His commandments. We might think of an ideal legal system where the legislature is fully in agreement with the judicial branch or the judicial system. That doesn't always occur in real life. Sometimes the legislature may make a law, and then the judicial branch of the government may fail to enforce it or may distort it in the way they apply it. But in God's situation, the legislation and the judgment is always going to fit together so perfectly that you can use these words synonymously. If God gives a commandment, then God's judgments based on the ideas in the commandment will be perfectly synchronous with that.
Yeah, He is lawgiver, He is judge. And even looking at these 10 commandments and thinking about the commands and even the moral principles behind them, and even seeing God's judgment, God's even his high character that He has as God Himself and as part of His nature comes out in the giving of these laws. And I was just thinking about even the historical context in which all these things happen and the giving of these laws and just what the nations and the culture was during that time and just how significant these were. And I know sometimes, and this is maybe getting a little off topic, but it deals some with what we're going to look at in the 10 Commandments and how we treat other people and how slaves were treated in the Old Testament and just how much care was given in the giving of the law towards how you could treat a slave, even at times slaves being released and laws concerning that, and just how, at that time, how radical that was, and for a long time, and giving laws that basically covered everyone.
Right, the treatment of the poor and the treatment of the widows and the strictures on fairness and not merely avoiding stealing something from another person, but avoiding even the state of heart that would lead you to steal something from someone. So there's so much of a high morality that is special to the law that God gave the Israelites that was not present in the legal codes of other societies. Not that they didn't have any sense of justice. They're all created in the image of God, but this was the best legal system that ever had been given up until that time. Even though it's inferior to the law of Christ, our very theme verse for this year from Romans 7 and verse 12 says that the law of Moses was holy and just and good. And that's really Paul's big point about the law when he discusses its quality, is that it was good for the time in which it was given. There was nothing that was lacking as far as a covenant is concerned that what made it inappropriate for its time. Rather, it was the perfect schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. It's not the Christian system. It doesn't provide ultimate forgiveness of sins. It only provides forgiveness of sins in anticipation of the sacrifice of Christ. But it is perfect for what God designed it to do.
Yeah, and when he says that he found fault with it or fault with them, it wasn't that he found fault with the law, for the law was perfect. It was that the people, right? There was fault in the people, and that they could not, and they did not keep that law perfectly. And this goes all into the book of Hebrews.
And that will be our subject for next month.
Yeah.
So we're not going to get into that too much because Ben has written some great notes that
Yeah.
we'll consider next month, but that certainly is the case. I appreciate you bringing that up. Let's move to think about the environment at Sinai in Exodus 19, beginning in verse 18. I'm just going to read a few verses here. And I asked our diggers this month, Chris, to consider the awe-inspiring environment that was theirs to behold and what frightened them. And I asked the diggers to consider some other passages of Scripture that might give us some insight as to what God was trying to accomplish by giving the law in such a circumstance. God could have just dropped down the law from heaven, but he called Moses up onto the mountain, and the circumstances we're about to read would have surely struck awe into the hearts of the Israelites. So let's read it together. Exodus 19, beginning in verse 18. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go down, warn the people that they do not break through to the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, or else the Lord will break out against them." Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, 'Set bounds about the mountain and consecrate it.' Then the Lord said to him, 'Go down and come up again, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, or he will break forth upon them.' So Moses went down to the people and told them." Obviously, one of the things that God accomplishes here is the separation of Moses and Aaron as leaders of the people, as compared not only to the ordinary Israelites, but also even the priests. So there's something special about Moses and Aaron as leaders. But I'm thinking about, for example, Deuteronomy 4:10 through 12, where Moses says, "Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb." Well, that would have been a memorable day.
Yes.
That was something that was unforgettable. Or Deuteronomy 5:4, as Moses is just about to reiterate the Ten Commandments. He says, "The Lord spoke to you face to face at the mountain from the midst of the fire." There's the metaphorical usage of this phrase, face to face, because obviously they didn't see God's face. But the meaning here is that God spoke to the people in a pretty direct way. Even though it was through Moses, God communicated with them in a way where they felt the presence of God pretty directly.
Wouldn't this signal to the magnitude and the importance of the event? I just think about all of this is happening, and I go back to even what happened for Moses before he entered into Egypt,
Right.
with the burning bush. I mean, that was something that was awe-inspiring. It was unusual, and it signified an important event. You know, Moses going back in there to lead the people out, and then they come across, and now there's this an event, but even in a greater magnitude, happening here at Mount Sinai for all these people. And wouldn't this be kind of a signaling that this was an important occasion? This was something that needed to be remembered, and even here showing maybe even the separation between God and his people as far as power and might.
Of course.
And
yes.
maybe there was questions coming out. Well, what? And they knew of Jehovah, they knew of God, the Lord, but they weren't going to know him then as well as they were going to know him after the law and after the wilderness and after all these things. And just God showing and saying, this is me. I'm powerful. I have the right to hand you this law, to give this law down.
The urgency of keeping it
Yeah.
surely came across. And when you brought up the burning bush, it made me think of how many times God appeared in fire to make a point. Not only in Exodus 3, but also here, and then when Nadab and Abihu died in Leviticus 10:1 and 2, and then when Korah's, the people who supported Korah died with fire coming out from before the Lord. And God made an impact in the minds of people by appearing with fire, and of course in other ways as well. And the fire is brought up in Deuteronomy 5, verses 22 through 24 again. In verse 22 it says, "The Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain from the midst of the fire." And then at the end of verse 24 there, "We have heard his voice from the midst of the fire. And he shone forth," according to Deuteronomy 33 and verse 2, "from Sinai." And so when we think about the magnitude of that moment, I think we can appreciate that if the Israelites had any question in their mind about whether it was urgent for them to keep the law, well, God's method of appearing to them in this theophany would surely have settled the question in their minds.
And this in many ways was the beginning of their knowledge. It was the beginning of their knowledge as God's covenant people. And it reminded me of what it says in Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And fools despise wisdom and instruction. But here, God striking in them fear and learning to have a healthy, respectful fear of God and his power and might. And that's exactly what God does here at Mount Sinai and says, you need to learn first and foremost to fear me with a healthy, respectful fear. And that's the setting in which he gives these 10 commandments.
Sometimes we talk about the two different meanings of the word fear in the Bible, where one is the terror and the other is the reverence. And we as Christians, because we're forgiven of our sins, have the reverence. We don't have the terror in the same sense that a sinner would. But we don't need to separate those things too far to where we forget that God actually is terrifying. And his power is so much greater than ours that we want to make sure we're never on his wrong side.
Sure.
And to lose sight of God's terrifying nature is to forget the urgency, at least in one respect, the urgency of keeping his commands. We keep his commands not just because he could punish us if we didn't, but that surely is one reason, as Jude explains in Jude 23, that some we save with fear by pulling them out of the fire. So that's very good. Okay, let's talk about the designation of the 10 Commandments. Chris, as I'm sure you know, there are 3 passages where these are called the 10 Commandments. So that phraseology is not my doing or anybody's doing. It's the Bible's doing. And those 3 passages, as the diggers know, are Exodus 34:28, Deuteronomy 4:13, and Deuteronomy 10 and verse 4. Now, Chris, there are 613, according to the count that I've always heard, 613 commandments in the law of Moses, and yet these are the 10.
Yes.
And so these are special, or these are significant. They have a logical priority before all of the others. It doesn't mean that you're free to break, if you're an Israelite in the Old Testament, you're free to break the others, and you got to keep the 10. But there is something unique about these 10, and I would suggest that, see what you think about this, I would suggest that if you keep the 10 as they are supposed to be kept, then you're going to keep all the rest that apply to you.
So would we be right maybe in saying that these 10 are kind of foundational?
Yes, I think so.
Foundational in their laws? And it reminds me, because they're often called the 10, and it almost made me think of the 12 apostles, and how they were called the 12.
The 12 disciples, even though there are many other disciples.
Sure, there are many other disciples, and we might say there might be other apostles in that it means one sent. Someone can be
in the generic sense.
In the generic sense, but they might not be one of the 12 apostles.
Right. And even the word covenant is used synonymously with the phrase the 10 Commandments in Exodus 34:28 and Deuteronomy 4:13, and I would point you also to 2 Corinthians 5:10. But notice that the covenant can be, or the covenant can be summed up in the 10 Commandments. And actually, it can be summed up even more. In Matthew 7:12, Jesus said the law and the prophets is to, as far as ethical law is concerned, which is the last 6 of the 10 Commandments, the ethical laws, the laws about how we treat one another, those can all be summarized by this idea of keeping the golden rule, or I should say the last 5 of the 10 Commandments. So, at any rate, the Ten Commandments are in a special category. I gave a quotation from Martin Luther about how that well, let me just read it. I thought it was a pretty good statement. This much is certain. Those who know the Ten Commandments perfectly know the entire Scriptures, and in all affairs and circumstances are able to counsel, help, comfort, judge, and make decisions in both spiritual and temporal matters. Well, this is a hyperbolic statement. Obviously, you memorize the Ten Commandments. That doesn't mean you've memorized the whole of the Bible. And yet, let's just think about that first one. If you don't have any other God other than the God of heaven, and you place him first, then you're going to do what he says. And you're not going to build any graven image. And if you don't have any other God that's before him, then you would never want to take his name in vain or treat him as though he's unholy. You know, God states as the principle from which he will draw the Ten Commandments that he is their God, that there is no other God besides him. So the first part of the Ten Commandments, and it is the first four. I was miscounting. I was not thinking to myself. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But those commands about how we relate to God are based upon the idea that we treat God as being what he really is, that he's really our God.
Yeah, and even looking at the back end of that with the other six, and honoring the most important people in our lives with fathers and mothers. If we can learn to love and respect and treat well those people that are close to us, well, that should be a foundational setting for how we're going to treat other people as well. And to me, if you look at someone who doesn't know how to honor their father and mother, I don't have much reason to believe that they're going to be able to honor or respect anyone else. Because if you can't honor and respect the people who brought you into this world, then what makes me think you can honor and respect a stranger or someone you simply work with or someone you see in passing? You know, and again, I think it goes back to the foundational things here. If we can get these things right, then everything else should just fall into place. Everything else should be much easier to do in either respecting and honoring God or respecting and honoring our neighbor.
Okay, let's think then. I agree with what you're saying. Let's think about some questions that people might have about this. One is a question that we got on Facebook about how would dietary and medicinal restrictions fit in as implications of the Ten Commandments. So if I'm going to say all the other laws of the Old Testament really reflect the overarching principles of the Ten Commandments, then how do these restrictions about not eating this or not eating that, or the medicinal restrictions, how do they fit in? And I think a passage that will help us on this, and you may think of another one, is Leviticus 11, verses 43 through 45. And this has to do with the clean and unclean animals. It's at the end of the chapter. And it says, "Do not render yourselves detestable through any of the swarming things that swarm." That's the one that Moses is talking about there. "And you shall not make yourselves unclean with them so that you become unclean. For I am the Lord your God." Now, think about that phrase. That's in Exodus 20 and verse 2. Same principle. I am the Lord your God. "Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth, for I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy." So the same reason for which someone would avoid the swarming things, which may seem like a much less significant command in some regards than not having a graven image, but the same reason you would avoid those bugs is because the Lord is your God who brought you up out of Egypt. And so whatever he commands means that I must obey even in the details of the law. Even, for example, in the Sabbath day, where when the Israelites got that command, they might have thought, surely I can respect and honor God without taking every seventh day off from work. But that was what God expected.
Yeah, and looking at those dietary restrictions, I think we can see from the New Testament once we get there and what happened with Peter in Acts chapter 10 and the letting down of the blanket or the sheet that had the unclean animals in it. And God eventually, we don't have those same dietary restrictions in the New Testament. So was it that God had to have those dietary restrictions in there, or he chose to have them in there? And why would he put those in there? If we don't have them today, And they did have them in the Old Testament. Well, why were they put in there? And I think it does even go back to some of the Ten Commandments we're looking here. Do we love and honor God? Do we fear God? Are we willing to keep him? And the fact if he says, if you eat this, you are going to be unclean, which is obviously going to affect my ability to be able to come and worship him, because, again, he deals with worship there in the Ten Commandments and worshiping him alone and no other gods. And so he says, avoid these things, and you will be clean as far as those dietary restrictions go, and you can approach me in worship. So it all goes back here to the worship. It all comes back to them being clean and being able to approach God for worship.
Set apart from the world. That word consecrated means sanctified or set aside, set apart for God's purposes. And obviously there are commands in the Old Testament that help them stay physically safe, help them to avoid diseases. That's in the context of Leviticus 11. We've talked about that before, but not all the commands in the Old Testament had to do with that. Some of them do seem arbitrary, but we've always got to respect God even in commands that he gives that may seem arbitrary to us.
And we can see how those commandments did help them physically, and were put even in many of those put in place for their own physical good, because even though we don't keep those same laws today, we still practice many of them. Think of all the laws concerning mold in a house.
That's a good point.
Right. I don't get rid of the mold in my house because God told the Old Testament Israel people to do that. I do it because I know of the negative consequences to my health and to my family if I don't.
Sure.
And so, as you said, many of those were put in place there for their own good, and we can still follow those today because we know it's even for our good and our benefit physically.
There's an interesting book by two medical doctors, McMillan and Stern, called None of These Diseases, and it tracks the Israelites' commandments in terms of how it would have helped them medically. And I would urge people to look at that. Not members of the church, so we might not agree with everything that's in that book, but it is a helpful catalog of showing how many of the commands that God gave the Israelites were far advanced medically as compared to the laws in Egypt where Moses was educated. And then it will help us see that the Old Testament is inspired and also help us appreciate God's love for the Israelites as he took them out of bondage. Okay, now another question someone might have about the categorization here of the Ten Commandments and how they are set apart from the rest of the law is Jesus' statement about how the greatest of the commandments in the law, according to Matthew 22:36 through 38, is not one of the Ten Commandments. It's rather from Deuteronomy 6:4 and 5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, if we take Matthew's and Luke's and Mark's account of the greatest commandment. So someone might say, if the Ten Commandments are the pinnacle or the foundation, however you make your metaphor, if they're the foundation of the law of Moses, then why would Jesus come along later and say the greatest of all the commandments is not even one of the Ten Commandments?
Well, wouldn't you have to look to see what's the foundation of the foundation? Kind of like, what's the foundation of the foundational Ten Commandments? And the foundation of that was, look, I just saved your disrespectfulness. I just saved you disrespectful people. And I say that because of what things that they did afterwards.
Right.
But I saved you from slavery. I brought you out of Egypt. I delivered you from Egypt. I brought you out of slavery and bondage, and I'm bringing you into a land of promise. So ultimately, even their foundation for keeping the Ten Commandments was that God delivered them and that God saved them.
I think this would be a good time for us to read the first part of the Ten Commandments, verses 1 through 6 in Exodus 20. And I want us to observe that loving kindness, God's love for the people, is built in to his covenant with them right from the very beginning. And so the logical expectation would be that people should obey this covenant not just out of fear, but also as an expression of reciprocating God's love. So let's read beginning in verse 1, Exodus 20. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, here you are, Chris, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. There's God's righteous jealousy, not envy, but righteous jealousy, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and on the fourth generations of those who hate me. We'll talk about that in subsequent months, about how God visits the consequences of people's sins on subsequent generations. But notice verse 6, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. So part of the reason you keep the first two commandments is that God is loving. And if that's the case, then wouldn't you say that a foundation to keep that would lead you to keep any of the 10 Commandments is that you love God because you appreciate His love for you. So there is a reciprocal affection that is presupposed as part of the obedience of the commandments.
Yeah, and just tracing God's love back through the children of Israel and all the things that happened, going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and looking at that and how God has brought them to this point. And it is a foundation of love, that God first loved them, and that in turn, because of all the things that who God is and because what He has done for us, we in turn love Him. And so it's an appreciation for us. And if we are struggling with, even in the New Testament and being Christians, keeping the commandments, we need to go back to the foundational thing of, well, I probably then have a love problem. If I'm struggling to keep God's commandments, it's because of a lack of love. And so I need to go back and think about what all God has done for me and how much He loves me. And then in turn, have a love and appreciation for Him, which will drive me on to keep His commandments.
God's commandments are not burdensome or grievous. God's commands are in our interest. God's commands are, right here at the outset, an expression of His love, of His desire for our best interest. Let's think, Chris, for a little bit about how the 10 Commandments are part of a larger covenant. And we've been talking about the 10 Commandments as one of many commands, but those are all part of a covenant or an agreement. So we want to think about that particular idea. Now, the word translated covenant in the Old Testament refers to various kinds of agreements, not just between God and man, but also between individual people and between organizations or nations, brethren, people who are in a very close relationship, friendship, like David and Jonathan had a covenant. So we need to think about the system of agreement of which the 10 Commandments were part. So I asked the diggers to look at examples of covenants between various men or groups of people, even nations, and to think about some salient features of covenants. And I just made some notes about covenants, and you may want to add some, but I thought about how covenants are agreements between two parties. Covenants may have some promise that's given on behalf of one of the parties. In this case, we're going to see that God makes His promises to bless the Israelites, but also the Israelites make an agreement that they're going to keep the covenant, that most notably at the end of Deuteronomy as they're about to enter the promised land. There may not be a promise on both parts, that is, on both parties in a covenant. For example, in the rainbow covenant in Genesis 9, God makes a promise on His part to never destroy the earth again with water. Noah doesn't make a promise on his part. It's just that God says He's not going to do that anymore, and it's an unconditional promise. So God doesn't tell Noah, keep these rules, and if you don't break these rules, I won't destroy the earth again with water. He just says He won't ever do it. There may be an intense personal connection, as in the friendship of David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel 18. It may be an alliance between political leaders, and I'm going to count Abraham as a political leader in the sense that he had many people who were under his supervision. But you've got covenant between Abraham and Abimelech in Genesis 21, Isaac and Abimelech in Genesis 26, Jacob and Laban in Genesis 31. Marriage is itself considered a covenant. It's called that in Malachi 2:14. So we have a number of different examples of covenants, and I've just touched the hem of the garment. We could find many others.
Wouldn't the agreement between Abraham and Lot have been a covenant,
Yes.
sort of agreement that
Yes.
said, well, I'll go to this part and you go to that, and that was a covenant agreement that they had between one another. When I think about covenant, Caleb, I think about what are the two parties getting out of it. What is whether it's an agreement not to attack each other, right? And so both of them are kind of saying, well, we're going to get peace out of this and some kind of security out of it. Or maybe it's a promise to provide something. I have an agreement that I'll provide you with this lumber and you provide me with some kind of,
like Hiram and Solomon.
Yes, they had some kind of agreement with that. But then I think about, what does God get out of making a covenant with humanity? And when I sit here and think of it, I think, well, he doesn't really get anything. I mean, he doesn't need anything.
Right.
It's him providing everything. It's so strange. I mean, God doesn't get out of a covenant what we get out of it. I mean, he's providing everything towards the covenant.
We're the recipients, and he's the
recipient.
beneficiary.
And
he's the one who offers it to us.
And if you were looking at this and thinking maybe about two nations, and you maybe have this one nation who has everything and they don't need anything, and they make some covenant with this smaller nation, and it just seems like that's kind of what's going on here between us and God, and just being thankful and grateful that God has chosen. One, he chose to make a covenant with the children of Israel, but also to make a covenant with us through Jesus, and that God is providing all these things when he needs nothing from us.
Right. He certainly has no needs. We think, for example, about Acts 17:25. He is not served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. So he's the donor, and we're the beneficiary. God wants relationship with us so that he may bless us, because we can't have the blessing of relationship with him unless God makes that a possibility. And he certainly has done that for us through Christ, for which we're very grateful. I asked about, were there agreements on the part of the parties? And always there's going to be some acknowledgement. If the covenant exists, there's going to be some acknowledgement of it between the parties. But in this case, with the Ten Commandments, we especially have a statement of agreement that the Israelites say, we will do it. Exodus 19, verse 8, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And in Exodus 24:3, they say again, now we're after the giving of the commandments, and they say, all the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do. So there's an agreement on both parts. And then there are often objects that are used to solemnize a covenant. We think of the rings that are exchanged in a wedding ceremony. Those are the objects that we use to make this occasion something that is solemn in our minds and official. We make it official with those typically, or they're symbols of what's happened. And witnesses are sometimes employed in the same way to say either this object or these people are either literal or metaphorical witnesses. For example, in Joshua 24:22, the people say, oh, we're going to put away our foreign gods, which they, by the way, they didn't really do permanently, but they say they're going to do it. And Joshua says, you are witnesses against yourself that you're going to do this. In the case of the law of Moses, as in the case of the Ten Commandments specifically, Moses sets up an altar in Exodus 24:4-8, an altar of 12 stones on which he sprinkles the blood of the burnt offering. It's down there at the foot of Mount Sinai, and he sprinkles the blood on the people as well. So that's an object to mark the occasion, to solemnize what's happened. God gave the rainbow in Genesis 9, verses 9-17, to say this is the sign of the covenant. So there's something that appears, not necessarily miraculously, but there's something that appears that you can see that's a symbol of the covenant. And there's something very powerful about that, isn't it?
Yeah,
isn't there?
And God gave them these things, or they had these objects to remember this. And I even think of another event when they crossed over the Jordan and into the Promised Land, and they were to set up again those 12 stones.
Right, representing the 12 tribes.
And he told them, when you come by this with your children, when your children's children come by this, you are to tell the story of all this that happened and remind that next generation of what had happened. And it's interesting. I didn't think about, too, the the giving of rings as well as kind of those
Mm-hmm.
things that God or that we use to psalmize an object.
I thought about the goat and heifer and ram and turtle dove and pigeon in Genesis 15, where Abraham wanted a sign from God about the promise to give him a son, or circumcision itself was the sign of the covenant between the descendants of Abraham and God. Eliezer placing his hand under Abraham's thigh in Genesis 24, and the same thing is done by Joseph with Jacob when he's about to die in Genesis 47. Jacob and Laban put up a heap of stones at Mizpah, which was sort of the end of their feuding, that they were going to be at peace with one another. And so now let's shift gears and think about who initiated the covenant between God and Israel. Somebody has to step out and say, this is going to be an agreement. I propose an agreement. Somebody's got to propose it. And in this case, it was all on God's part, wasn't it? The Israelites didn't approach him and say, please make an agreement with us. He did it. For example, Joshua 7 verse 11 says, Israel has sinned. They have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. Not just I offered it. I said, you're going to keep this. This is for you. Or Numbers 25:12, therefore say, behold, I give him my covenant of peace. So Israel was given a covenant of peace. It was on God's part to offer it, which was a great blessing. It's not as though God came with something that was bad for them and say, here, drink this medicine. You've got to take this. It was something that was good for them.
Yeah, and I just think thinking about the kind of the intermediary there, Moses being the one who was going up onto the mountain and then coming back down and giving them the laws. And he just didn't go up once, and I don't know if you have any plans to talk about this, but he goes up and then he comes down and then he goes up, and it's not just one trip up the mountain while they're there on their journey.
Right.
But he would go up and sometimes spend long periods of time and then come down, and then he might go up again. And we know that when he came down one time, the commandments were broken. He had to go back up again.
Right, in chapter 32.
As well.
Yes.
But I think, too, about how he would come down and his face would be shining because he had been in the presence of God. And they wanted him to put a veil over his face to cover it while he was giving us that. And, not going too much into the New Testament stuff here, but even Jesus, how he was the one. He was that pure image and representation of Jesus Christ. And when he gave us our covenant, which is so much better than the covenant that Moses gave. But that, too, kind of being a symbol there, that go back more to what we were talking about with the mountain, but that being Moses coming down and his face shining whenever he would give them those commandments.
We have so much more to talk about, and we're running out of time, Chris. This has been a great study. Let's just briefly review the sections that we haven't talked about. I wanted us to discuss the clarity of the Ten Commandments in that they were given in words that were understandable. And basically there I just wanted to emphasize for the diggers that God has always revealed himself in understandable ways. Not that we can plumb the depths of God's knowledge, but whenever God gives us commands or explains things that he wants us to know, we can always understand it. It's always in words. It's not in vague feelings or urges. God comes and says, here are these statements that you need to understand and follow. And it's the same way in the New Testament. But just again and again, we're impressed with God saying, here are the words that you need to know. Like Deuteronomy 6:6, when God tells the Israelites to teach their children, he begins by saying, these words which I'm commanding you, not just these vague concepts or not these visions, but these words. Or Deuteronomy 11:18, you shall therefore impress these words of mine on your heart and on your soul. And then we have statements like in the New Testament, in John 6:68, Peter says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. So God gives understandable words.
And there might be particulars in the Word of God that are difficult maybe to understand, but the overall message is meant to be simple and easy to relate to other people. That's why he could say, tell this to your children. It's supposed to be able to be simple enough that the children can understand it, although they may not understand all the different particulars and the difficulties of those things. The overall message is a simple message.
That's right. One more thing, and then we'll have to stop. But what about this idea that the covenant would last forever? because that's what the Bible says in Exodus 28:43, 31:17, 32:13. Does the word translated forever in the Old Testament, olam, literally mean without end in every case? I asked the diggers to do some reading about this, and we found that the answer is no. It can refer to something that is of a long duration, but not necessarily literally everlasting in nature. We think, for example, about Exodus, or rather Deuteronomy 15:17, where a man says that he's going to be a slave to his owner forever because he loves his owner, so he has a hole pierced in his ear with an awl, and he says he's going to be a servant forever. That doesn't mean he thought he would never die, that he would continue being his servant literally forever. After the Israelites visited King Rehoboam and asked him to lighten the burdens, the elders said that the king should be kind to the people and they would be his servants forever. So that just shows you that the Hebrew word translated forever can mean for a long period of time, but not necessarily literally forever. Or it may mean like an indefinite, a long indefinite. It's long, and we don't know when the end is going to be.
We use the word in the same way today. We don't always use it in its most literal sense. Even if you say to your wife, I want to be married to you forever. Well,
sure.
We understand that, once we pass, even go back to Romans chapter 7 and others, that we're no longer married to that individual.
Yes.
And so it will come to an end, but it's just saying that, as long as I'm here, as long as our bond is together, then I'm committed to you.
Yes, and there are so many passages. I have given the diggers a list of these to consider that teach the limited duration of the law of Moses, that there was an everlasting covenant that was going to come. Implication, the present covenant is not the everlasting covenant. If one is coming that's going to be everlasting, then the one you're living under presently is not the everlasting one. Passages like Jeremiah 31:31 and following, Ezekiel 37:26, and how great this new covenant was going to be. That must have been remarkable for the Israelites to hear, that as good as the law of Moses was, and as much success as they had whenever they followed it, there still was going to be a covenant that was even greater than that. Mm-hmm. Must have been hard for them to fathom.
Yeah, that there would be a better covenant coming than the one that they were currently under. But that was something they looked forward to.
That's right.
Hebrews 7:12 is another, with the changing of the priesthood, there must also be a changing of the law. And so the priesthood was changed, and we know that from the New Testament as well. And so God didn't intend for that priesthood to be forever. And even considering what we're talking about under God's laws and in the Ten Commandments, that there would be a change as well.
Right. That's a good place to leave our study for today, because next month we will be talking about a lot of these New Testament principles and how Jesus thought about the Ten Commandments and how the apostles thought about them. And I will just say as a preview, the Ten Commandments are never denigrated in the New Testament. Even though they're taken out of the way, even though we're Christians and not following the law of physical Israel from the Old Testament, they are upheld as quality commands. The moral quality of the Ten Commandments is never questioned, and all but one of them is carried over into New Testament legislation. So we will look forward to studying that with you next time. Continue digging, and there is documentation on the website, and you can go to calebcolley.com/digging deep for instructions on how to utilize the study. If you are a little bit unclear about how to read through the questions and answer them, and if you want some help with resources that you can use to aid you in your study, then feel free to go to that website, calebcolley.com/digging deep, and all of that information is there. Additionally, I will remind you that our podcast is always available on various podcast platforms. If you use Apple Podcasts, if you use Spotify, if you use Google Play, on any of those formats, you can download this podcast and listen to it at your convenience. You can subscribe to it so that whenever we publish another one, you will be notified of that. Of course, we also post the video podcast on the Facebook group. So however it is that it's easiest for you to access this, we would encourage you to do it. And I would like to urge you to make comments on the Facebook board. We have fewer comments than I would like, and I know that some of us may be hesitant to post, but you will be encouraged about this, and your comments will receive thoughtful feedback, not just from me and Ben and others who are in the group, but you will find that everybody is welcoming of your comments and will enjoy reading them and commenting on them and thinking about them, and you will help the podcast by virtue of your posts on there. So please do comment, and if I can be of any assistance personally in helping you with your study of the Ten Commandments this year, please feel free to reach out to me on Facebook or by email, as you can see my contact information on the blog, calebcolley.com. And we'll look forward to a good year of study together. Chris, thank you so much for filling in the podcast today. Chris and I have a great working relationship here at Lakeside, and we're thankful to have him today. And Lord willing, Ben will be over his sickness well before we tape the podcast in October, and he'll be back with us as our co-author and co-host. Thank you very much.